Last October, I decided to check out the Game of Thrones book series, and I'm a different person now. The first book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series is the one where the show takes its name from, A Game of Thrones. It took me about 2.5 months to read it because I am a very slow reader, but unlike any of the few books I've ever read before, I was hooked on this one. It wasn't very different from the first season of the TV series. In fact, I'd say that season 1 of Game of Thrones is a near perfect adaptation of the events in this book, but when there are differences, I have to concede that the books did them better. I think it's mostly because season 1 of the show was still finding a budget, so most of the action scenes are cut shorter or cut entirely from their book counterparts. Aside from those 3 or 4 action sequences though, it's a perfect adaptation. The second book, A Clash of Kings, surprised me in a multitude of ways. Adapted into the second season of the show, it might seem about as identical as the first book's adaptation on paper, but there's a lot of really compelling writing that I think propels this book far beyond the second season of the show. You see, I've always considered the second season of Game of Thrones to be the weakest of the first 4 seasons, or the golden years as I like to call them. Not a whole lot of action happens, save for the Battle of Blackwater, and most of the season is just laying the groundwork for interesting moments to come by expanding on the characters. The same could absolutely be said about the story in A Clash of Kings, but I think the books have one key advantage in an exposition-heavy story: inner dialogue. The inner dialogue makes the events of this book so much more interesting, and you get a much better insight into the politics at play. Sure, the show does a great job at adapting Tyrion's accomplished reign as Hand of the King, but the book gives you so much more insight as to what he means to do in each scene, how he feels about other characters, and the true level of cunning hiding behind his smug facade. This level of insight into the characters' minds greatly adds to the stories of Catelyn, Jon Snow, Ser Davos, and especially Theon, who almost looks like an insane person in the show when he's really just an insecure child. On top of that, the Battle of Blackwater is the most vivid and epic battle imaginable, and as well as the show portrays it, it doesn't hold a candle to the insane action in the book. By the time I made it to Book 3, I was ecstatic to read it. Season 3 of Game of Thrones is where the story gets good, and Season 4 is a slam dunk perfect season of television in my eyes. So the 900-page book that contains the events of both seasons, with the added expectation that whatever differences might happen will make the story even better somehow, had me more excited to read this book than anything that has ever gotten me excited before. But in that lies the twist of this video, that despite my reverence for George R.R. Martin's writing, I firmly believe that the TV series outperformed the book. I'm not disappointed by that, mind you. If anything, I'm grateful that I have a reason to return to the show, since it's not inferior in every way. And in no way am I saying that the third book, A Storm of Swords, is bad. It's great, in fact. So great that I'm just as excited to start the fourth book and see how things really start to change. What makes the show better, you should probably be wondering. Quite a bit, actually, but I think it could boil down to 3-ish storylines that are written and directed with an absurd amount of grace in the show. Those storylines are, in order of increasing greatness, the Red Wedding, the Battle for the Wall, and the Trial of Tyrion Lannister. Let's start with the Red Wedding. As I said before, Season 3 of Game of Thrones is where shit gets good, and the same can be said for the third book. In both, Jon Snow falls in love with a wildling girl, experiencing the battle between love and duty. Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth make their perilous adventure to King's Landing. Tywin Lannister takes over as Hand of the King, undoing all of Tyrion's hard work with no due credit. Arya Stark travels with the Brotherhood Without Banners and the Hound for a bit, just trying to get home. Daenerys is probably doing something important in the East. I won't really be discussing that in this video. And Robb and Catelyn are marching north to retake Winterfell from the Greyjoys. For the most part, I think the book and TV series do a great job at telling these stories. There's plenty of differences to be sure, but this time around the changes in the show make it a much more concise narrative. For example, the removal of Ser Cleos Frey, a traveling companion of Jaime and Brienne in A Storm of Swords, who hangs around for a while until he's eventually killed by outlaws. He doesn't add much at all to the story, so in the show, Jaime kills him off much earlier. By the end of the third season, or about 500 pages into A Storm of Swords, Catelyn and Robb attend a wedding hosted by the Lord of the Crossing, Walder Frey. After Robb betrayed Lord Frey's trust by not marrying one of his daughters, the goal of this wedding is to rekindle the relationship between the Starks and the Freys by marrying Cat's brother Edmure Tully to the surprisingly beautiful Rosalind Frey. Without House Frey's good graces, Robb cannot hope to reach the north, so he's willing to do and say whatever it takes to please the slimy lord. As you should hopefully know if you're watching this video, Robb is met with betrayal by the Freys, who break all rules of hospitality by slaughtering the Northmen during the wedding feast. Lord Roose Bolton, one of Robb's bannermen, is also a conspirator in the mix, making the scene even more devastating. That's the vague description of the events, but what are the differences between the show and the book, and why do I think the show did it better? For starters, Catelyn's wariness works really well on screen. Whereas the book places us inside her head, the show seats us next to her at the dinner table, where the unease is at its most palpable. Hearing the Rains of Castamere play is also incredibly spine-chilling on screen, as it's the background music for the Lannisters in almost every scene they're in, and if you're fast enough to realize what that means, it's enough to give you goosebumps. A pretty big change in the scene is Catelyn's realization that they're being betrayed. In the books, she confronts one of the Frey men at the door, only to realize that he's wearing chainmail. TV Catelyn discovers that Roose Bolton is wearing chainmail instead, and while both scenes accomplish the same thing, I think the show giving the honors to Roose Bolton makes it more immediately shocking, and the slap she gives him is one of the only moments of mild satisfaction we can get in this bloodbath. Robb's wife, who's an entirely different person in the books, doesn't actually come to the wedding in the book at all, and therefore isn't brutally slaughtered like everybody else. While it's a hard scene to watch in the show, Talissa's stabbing is the inciting moment of violence, setting the atmosphere for how bloody the scene is about to be right away. The books hint that the family of Robb's wife are also part of the betrayal, and while that can lead us to some interesting stories in the future, I think the show simplifying her presence in the narrative was a good choice, especially since it gives Robb something to do in the middle of the massacre, mourn his wife and child. To the book's credit, it's very disheartening to see several named characters put up a fight but ultimately perish in the slaughter, though I don't see a world where the show could concisely teach us all of Robb's bannermen when they really don't matter all that much by the end. Small John Umber is an MVP in the book, as he is able to flip a table to protect Robb quick enough to temporarily save his life. It doesn't go very far for either of them, but I appreciate the effort. After the massacre has died down, all that remains of the Northmen are Robb and Cat, both having already been shot with corals. Before it's too late, Catelyn takes a hostage in an effort to save Robb's life, and this is where I think the show absolutely outshines the book. In the book, Catelyn is able to hold Walder Frey's grandson at knife point, though the grandson is also a Lackwit and is officially the fool of the twins. Lord Frey's decision to sacrifice his fool in order to take Robb's life is still definitely heartless, but not nearly as much as the other hostage situation. In the show, Catelyn is able to get Lord Frey's current wife at knife point, someone who should mean a whole lot more to Walder considering, they're married. Michelle Fairley gives an outstandingly intense performance begging for her son's life, and Walder seems to contemplate his options for a few moments until he says the most dreadful words that the audience desperately didn't want to hear him say about his wife.
I'll find another.
From here on out, both scenes end about the same. Roose Bolton gives Robb a final stab in the gut, smugly saying the Lannisters send their regards in the show, and Jaime Lannister sends his regards in the books. Catelyn, watching her last son die before her, slits the throat of her hostage and completely dies on the inside. After a moment of silence, one of the Freys eventually slits her throat in return. Of course, the book does have some inner dialogue for Cat right before she dies that might be the saddest thing I've ever read, but if you're unfamiliar with that, go look into it yourself. I still have a lot to talk about. While you're at it, look into the character Lady Stoneheart, too, if you want the single greatest difference between the books and the show, unrelated to the scenes I'm already discussing in this video. Anyway, I could absolutely see people preferring the book's version of the Red Wedding since it offers a lot of supplementary nuances that the show doesn't have, like the inner dialogue and several named characters dying, but I can't help but love the show's version more. The pacing of the scene is incredible, and Michelle Fairley's performance is undeniably one of the best in the whole show. By comparison, the scene in the book is a lot less concise and a smidge less impactful. I've come to notice when reading the books that George R.R. Martin is a stickler for details and keeping a strong sense of realism. And while that absolutely makes the stories and characters come alive, it could sometimes write you into a corner. The Watchers on the Wall is one of the most intense episodes in the TV series, as the Night's Watch has to overcome insane odds to hold their ground against the Wildling army, despite that army outnumbering them 1,000 to 1, having giants and mammoths, and a small army of Thenns that climbed over the wall before to attack them unaware. On top of that, this episode caps off the romantic storyline between Jon Snow and Ygritte in the most heartbreaking way possible, as she's shot in front of him and dies in his arms. This episode is intense and fantastic in every way, and wraps up 4 seasons of the Night's Watch storyline in spectacular fashion. The books, however, took an extremely different approach. You see, a few chapters before the battle begins, Jon refuses to kill an innocent man and flees on horse from Ygritte and his wildling host, taking an arrow in the leg to go. After a long journey back to Castle Black, Jon's wound makes it impossible for him to be involved in swordplay, so when the wildlings come, he has to play the role of archer. In the books, the Battle for the Wall takes place over several coordinated attacks, the first of which being an attack by the Thenns, who Jon knows intimately from his time as a Turncloak. Despite not having many quality fighters, Jon is confident that the Watch will prevail, but knows that means the certain death of this group of wildlings he's come to know personally. He's right, unfortunately, as it is in this battle where Ygritte takes a mortal wound and dies before Jon, but unlike in the show, Jon isn't around to see her get shot, only finding her clinging to life after the battle has ended. Jon isn't allowed the wholesome smile he gives her at the sight of her in the show, but does at least get to hear her catchphrase one last time. Because the Night's Watch is successful against the attack led by Styr and the Thenns, the rest of the fighting happens later, when Mance Rayder's army finally makes it outside their gate. Mance sends dozens of giants, mammoths, soldiers, archers, and battering rams to take the gate, but it is because of Jon's strong leadership that the Night's Watch holds out against them. I'll stop the recap there, as the story will only continue to branch off into unknown territory from that of the show, but to summarize and explain why I think the show did this better, the key word once again is conciseness, with the bonus word being entertainment. Combining all of the events of the book into one hellish battle for the Watch is the best thing the show could have done when adapting the story, as we get the most important and impactful events one after another while trimming off the downtime. Within 50 minutes, we get Jon's incredible leadership skills, Ygritte's tragic and emotional death, Gren's sacrifice to protect the gate, Samwell overcoming his cowardice while Janos Slynt proves to be a sniveling man-baby, and some of the coolest action shots in the whole series. The show made the right choice by having Jon not be completely restricted by his leg injury, though I'll be the first to admit that the book is much more realistic in how these events would have played out if there was less of a focus on making good television. In any case, this is one of the best episodes in the series, and I'd be lying if I said the book's version of the events brought me anywhere close to my enjoyment of the episode. It's been well over 2 months since I wrote those first 2 parts of the video, mostly because I absolutely shattered my wrist back in June, but also because I'm very lazy. The good news is I made great headway into Book 4, A Feast for Crows, and I am absolutely loving it. It's basically an entirely different story from the show at this point, and the book only has like 6 characters in it, but that might be why I love it. It's refreshing and new, and I don't have to compare the book to the show anymore. That is to say, I'll finally be done comparing the book to the show after we talk about the wrecking ball that is the trial of Tyrion Lannister. Unlike the Red Wedding and the Battle for the Wall, I fully admit that I was kind of left disappointed by Tyrion's storyline in the second half of this book. Many of the scenes and dialogue of these chapters are identical to their respective scenes in the show, but everything seems bizarrely out of order. When we first meet Prince Oberyn Martell, for example, he opens up to Tyrion about his memories of him as a deformed baby. It's a brilliant monologue that gives us a lot of insight into Cersei's cruel disdain for her brother and Oberyn's rooted sympathy for Tyrion. This scene is in the show too, but it instead takes place many episodes after the two are first acquainted, when Tyrion is waiting in a cell for a warrior to come forth and defend him in a trial by combat. This is absolutely one of my favorite scenes in the entire show, as the build-up from Oberyn telling this story to Tyrion leads to an overwhelmingly emotional high when Oberyn declares that he will be Tyrion's champion. The music swells, Peter Dinklage and Pedro Pascal give some of their best performances to date, and the audience is left with ecstasy as something has finally gone right for Tyrion for the first time this season. It was a perfect decision to stitch these two scenes together like this, and the book is left looking lackluster by comparison. Oberyn's declaration in the book reads kind of nonchalantly, but that's open to interpretation and the imagination of the reader. Most of the scene is Oberyn putting Tyrion down for the sins of his family, but coming around at the last minute. Here's the actual text of the book's grand reveal. Your innocence may be as plain as a scar on your face, but it will not save you, no more than your father will. But I might. You, Tyrion studies him, you are one judge in 3. How could you save me? Not as your judge, as your champion.
I mean, it's alright.
For newcomers to the story, this was probably very exciting, but I think it lacks a lot of pathos, as the chapter doesn't do well to remind you of Oberyn's sympathy for Tyrion. Without the swelling music and Peter Dinklage on the verge of tears, I'm not nearly as impacted by this moment compared to the show. Another odd thing about this chapter of the book is that it happens before Tyrion decides to rest his fate on a trial by combat, so instead of Tyrion coming up with the idea on his own, it reads more like Oberyn's manipulation. This is certainly an interesting direction for Oberyn's character, and it should be very bluntly noted that many characters, especially Tyrion, can be very different from their show counterparts. But I quite like Tyrion's character in the show. He's just a heartfelt underdog, and while I respect George R.R. Martin for writing complex characters, I prefer well-meaning Tyrion over spitefully deranged Tyrion. I also prefer confident, heroic Oberyn over cunning, manipulative Oberyn. That's all beside the point, though. What I want to express in this last part of the video, and this applies to everything else I've talked about, is that while the writing of the book remains to be outstanding, the showrunners and actors brought their absolute A-game to make each and every scene a stunning display of good-ass cinema. Tyrion's speech when he demands a trial by combat is one of the juiciest monologues I have ever seen.
I'm guilty of being a dwarf.
You're not on trial for being a dwarf.
Oh. Yes, I am. I've been on trial for that my entire life.
Have you nothing to say in your defense?
Nothing but this. I did not do it. I did not kill Joffrey, but I wish that I had. Watching your vicious bastard die gave me more relief than 1,000 lying whores.
The book just doesn't have this sauce. It has the words, sure, but I can't even imagine a performance as powerful as that in my own head. Similarly, the trial by combat itself is electric from beginning to end, and by far one of the best action scenes in the series. They also nailed Tyrion's escape. There isn't a scene in the show more gratifying than Tyrion killing his father with his breeches down, and Charles Dance's performance as Tywin Lannister is legendary, and leagues better than the character in the book.
I'd never let them execute you. Is that what you fear? I'll never let Ilyn Payne take your head. You're a Lannister. You're my son.
It's these performances that are so damn good, and make me fonder of these moments in the show more than the books. Seasons 3 and 4 are just one massive roller coaster that clearly had so much passion and effort put into them. I think I'm rambling on at this point, but I hope I've made a good case for why I love these moments in the show so much, and I hope you don't hold it against me if you disagree with my opinions. This franchise means a lot to me, whether it be the show or the books, and if you enjoy either of them, then I consider us friends. I've been dying to discuss this series with more people, so please give me everything you've got in the comments, and consider subscribing if you're just as passionate as I am. All this talk has me weirdly emotional, so I'm going to end it here. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, adios.